And the usual format that we have been doing is that people maybe talk about their ideas for around 40 minutes, and then people can ask questions. We're shaking that up next year and making it a much more of a roundtable ideas sharing and discussion. Tom, you can play it either way if you want to be more formal about things and give the ordinary presentation, or anytime you want to practice anything fun and give us exercises, tell us to interpret particular things for you or whatever, just let us know.
Cool.
There is a function for breakup rooms, but I don't know how to do that. So if you want to do that, we will all be experimenting together. So tonight's or today's talk by Tom is called Melon, Twig, and Shifty, Describing, Unpacking, and Elucidating Methods in Skate Academia. I am now going to hand over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Indy. That was a lovely introduction. Sorry, my cat's going to be annoying this whole presentation. So, um, okay, let's get this rolling. I guess apologies for the bad pun in the title. Number one, I just waiting for someone to be able to make said joke around methods in skateboarding. So there we go. Can we all see this?
Yes.
Awesome. I might, yes, I might try and put it in presenter view. Can you see that in presenter view or normal view? Is this
We
in
can
presenter view?
see your slides, but we can also, well, at least where I am, I can see your next slide. The other one, there might be another option to make it larger.
Yeah. I could just, all right, I'm just gonna do it without the notes and see how it goes. Um, let's get it.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
the biggest on the screen, maybe for that's the largest that we can see it, so that's quite good for visibility sake.
Yeah. I'd do it like this and
Thank you,
yeah,
Tom.
it's right. Yeah, so today I'm gonna talk about a rolling ethnography. And like what does that mean? And sort of speak from my own experiences of researching skateboarding predominantly at the Freedom Skatepark, um, but not limited to, and sort of just talk about how I interpret what a rolling ethnography is, and then some of the just general ideas that kind of emerge around that. Um, I guess this is a general sort of introduction to the kind of work that I'm involved with. Um, if anyone has read some of my research and papers, um, I sort of marry my background in socially focused design interventions with skateboarding through my work with Concrete Jungle Foundation, which I've been involved with since 2018. And I sort of like use this concept called infrastructuring quite a lot, which is all about these temporally open-ended projects. And that kind of the literature and design that sort of engages with studying these kind of interventions call it a follow and see ethnography, which I think in terms of what we consider a rolling ethnography to be as something that's moving, going in a direction, that kind of like aligns already. So I find it complements each other really well. So yeah. So, but first, what is skateboarding? That is the question, right? The question we're all here, that's what we all share in common in this call. And for people who are going to be watching this back, we're all trying to answer this question in our own different way. Mr. Borden, our savior of skate. I'm kidding. He posed this question in 2001. Is it a sport? Is it hanging out with your friends? Is it a mode of transport? Is it a way to sell telephones? Is it a crime? Is it a piece of fashion? Is it art? Is it a pedagogy? It's all the above and more. We know by now that skateboarding is plural. It is skateboardings. What I consider skateboarding is very different to what you guys consider skateboarding. And that is the beauty of it. I think that is why people are so attracted to this quite strange phenomenon that we all hold dearly to our heart. So even 18 years or so later, we're still completely unaware, or maybe not completely unaware, but we're still trying to solve this mystery of what skateboarding is. So yeah, with that kind of start, one of the ways in which I have attempted to understand what skateboarding is through not just through my PhD, but through my work with Concrete Jungle Foundation, being their research and development officer. My role in the organization was and is to collect data around our work. And I always sort of articulate this to people. I always see my job as a bit of a translator, like collecting data and arranging it in a new language that funders or potential partners will be able to make sense of, and also be sort of excited about. So depending who that audience is, I tend to translate skateboarding in a different way, in a different language. And it's kind of really interesting sort of role for me as a researcher, researching skateboarding for Concrete Jungle Foundation, because I kind of do it in two different ways between my PhD and for my work. So this was a research project that I did in 2021 for Concrete Jungle Foundation to essentially create like a policy document, kind of testing our methodology in which we sort of use skateboarding to support young people in the areas of the world that we work. So this research project was framed in terms of these two bullet points on this slide. One of them was in terms of sports for development. I'm responding to this idea there's a lack of evidence in sports for development. I think as an organization, we sort of show these tendencies, and I think that's true for the sector as a whole. We're quite good at collecting data around things like participant numbers and age and gender and things like that, but we're not so good at sort of creating empirically robust accounts of the work that we do. And I just think in our motto of Concrete Jungle Foundation, we empower individuals and communities worldwide through fostering and sustaining the positive values inherent to skateboarding. That is just like a statement that's got this sort of like normative assumption that skateboarding is good, and we're always doing good when we use skateboarding in such contexts, which for both my PhD and my work with CGF is sort of putting that motto to the test and trying to prove it right, but also trying to understand the times in which skateboarding maybe isn't so inherently good. Anyway, so then I did this research project to test this kind of format, which is the carrot and stick. Skateboarding is the carrot, and the stick is sort of these other youth development programmings that take place at the Freedom Skatepark, but also across a lot of the other projects that we work at. So this is the really brief. So I'm just moving the side panel out the way. I might actually just minimize that. This is the really brief research outline in 2001. So it was trying to measure the carrot and the stick. The carrot being these Edge of Skate beginner skateboarding lessons, and the stick being the youth development survey. And yeah, it was like quite an ambitious project. Worked with 30 kids over 3 months who are in these beginner skateboarding lessons, and was using this child behavioral theory to sort of map changes in their sort of self-perceptions of their autonomy and sort of like sociality and stuff like that. And then seeing if like their involvement in the skateboarding lessons could account for those changes. And then to the right was like a youth development survey, which was sort of asking questions that were designed around Jamaica's like sustainable development goal policy document called Vision 2030 Jamaica. Here are sort of like some of the example surveys that we were handing out. So we were sort of doing surveys and interviews. To the left was what the kids in the beginner skateboarding lessons were answering, and to the right, basically everyone who went to the Freedom Skatepark over this 3-month period filled out this survey. I'm going to go through these like quite quick because it's not so much the results that I'm so much interested in, but more like the methodology. But anyway, once collecting all this data, we then put it through these like statistical analysis programming to sort of run regressions to see if skateboarding was sort of like statistically significant indicator for these like changes in the child's like behavioral, basically. And my two Greek friends, Panos and Panos, who are skateboarders living in Holland, but also doing PhDs in sort of the natural sciences, were like a huge help in helping me make sense of data. And I just find this image so crazy that like within these weird code and sticks on the screen, it's like trying to capture skateboarding or like an element of it, something that we kind of perceive to be so free and random and spontaneous, like trying to like stabilize that and put that through numbers and then produce something like that. I think it's just quite insane. But these are the outcomes. And like I said, I'm not too interested in going through the outcomes of the data. But again, it's like this is supposed to be skateboarding, what we're looking at now, which is crazy. And it's just really interesting. And just like really briefly, you can just see from the before and after, they all like improved and autonomy was statistically significant. But it was like super minuscule. Like a tiny change after 3 months of these like beginner skateboarding lessons. And kind of the interview data was kind of accounting for that slight increase, but giving a bit more depth, like another dimension to that, which, as we know as researchers, that's what interviews do. They sort of come through and speak about this more like personal, everyday occurrence, which this graph is capturing. And again, this is from the Youth Development Survey. To the left is just like really interesting data about like who's actually using the Freedom Skatepark, which was really useful for CGF to sort of like develop programming and like the organization of the space in relation to that. Again, just like the quotes again. What was really interesting about the outcomes of the graphs on the right is the 30 kids or so who were part of this research project. 50% were from the local community and 50% were from inner city Kingston, and they were coming to the skate park once a week to use it. And that created like a really interesting like comparison of graphs where the kids in the community, when you just isolated their results, they were showing like a way more apparent change, positive change. And originally the idea of having that two sample groups was to expect and predict that the kids coming from inner city Kingston were from like quite a rough neighborhood, and they were from like a youth center, particularly for vulnerable youth. And we expected they would actually see more change traditionally through this sort of NGO work. Kind of those from more vulnerable communities tend to see quicker, more rapid results. But the reverse happened. The community saw way more clear and statistically significant positive change. And the reason for that was essentially they were spending more time at the skate park. They were like more exposed to skateboarding, not just within these Edu-Skate lessons, the beginner skateboarding lessons. And that was really interesting because these graphs are like cool and they're an interesting way to think about skateboarding, and they can tell you that something else is happening, but they couldn't quite tell you why that was happening. But then obviously the interview data, for instance, the interview to the left just demonstrates, it's not just about these beginner skateboarding lessons, but also this kind of wider ecology of the skate park. So the mother on the left is sort of referring to the kind of role model structures that exist at the Freedom Skatepark. So I'll just skip over this again. Small outcomes. But I got really interested about that kind of the way that this research project was really interesting, and it was such an interesting way to think and trying to make sense of skateboarding. But it was just so like limited, because really we were defining the research project within this kind of sustainable development goal discourse. It was really like missing so much more that was going on at the skate park that kind of perhaps fell outside of that framework of the sustainable development goals, which for me and for my research, for my PhD, is kind of like the side of the Freedom Skatepark that I find like really fascinating, and probably, in my opinion, has the most profound impact for the people who use it and also like the wider community. So as we go through here, it's like every time that I was researching and trying to measure skateboarding, which before we spoke about being quite like a plural, multiple thing, every time I tried to research it and make sense of it in this quite singular way, it was kind of silencing or making invisible the other ways in which we could think about the Freedom Skatepark. So we like developed this theory of change, and again, just every time we do that, it's like, yeah, we're missing other stories that's happening here. And I've been reading this book at the moment called Computer Related Design Research Studio, The Presence Project, by this design researcher called Bill Gaver. And he talks about research in terms of, I'll probably say it wrong, the Rorschach test, that idea of where you sort of dip cloth in ink and it makes this symmetrical pattern, and then you show that to someone, and then that symmetrical pattern is sort of ambiguous and they make sense of it, and you sort of interpret that in this Freudian way to sort of look into the deeper psyche of someone. And I kind of think skate parks are similar in a way. They're like these kind of ambiguous symmetrical shapes, and you can look at it in a variety of ways, and the way you look at it can reveal sort of like your intentions. And as Indy said, for my research, for my PhD, I'm really looking at like transnational skateboard philanthropy, and that being, you know, a design PhD as well as about NGO work that kind of meets at these participatory sort of decolonial discourse. So it's really important, I found, to think in quite a critical way about my research and the way that I view it and the way that we publicize that, and kind of as an organization, the narratives about the work that we do and who has sort of like agency in producing that. And like I said, I felt like there was like really good value from this research project, and that was both for the organization in helping make sense of our work, and also the sector in hopefully showing ways in which we can understand our work, but also kind of being aware that it's very subjective, and in doing that, you know, we were presenting a very like singular version of the Freedom Skatepark, and yeah, in doing that, making sort of other narratives invisible. So here's, yeah, just a little quote about thinking about research along these lines. And I was doing this lecture, well, some of these ideas that we're obviously talking about now, I did in a lecture at UCL in creative health. And yeah, these ideas are like really inspired by the work of like Anne-Marie Moll, who's someone who researches like science from a sociological, like philosophical sense. And she wrote this like amazing book that's on the left called The Body Multiple Ontology in Medical Practice. And, you know, she talks about disease very similar to how we're talking about skateboarding being this plural thing that, you know, means different things to different people. So she looks at, again, another hard word to pronounce, osteosclerosis, which is a blood vessel illness. And she sort of describes how this isn't so much a really clear illness that we can really objectively point our finger at and say, you know, this is the illness. It's essentially like a collection of symptoms that affect people in different ways. So they have different relationships to this illness, this disease. And then she also highlights how researching the illness sort of produces different understandings of that disease. So she says kind of osteosclerosis is a different disease when you look at it in the pathology department than if she was to go to the outpatient clinic and sort of conduct interviews with the people who suffer from the disease. And again, that's what I really think came through that research project that I did for CGF in 2001. Skateboarding is very multiple, and the ways in which we research skateboarding sort of like affects our understanding of that. So then I think that becomes quite an interesting idea to explore through what we call a rolling ethnography, which is like, yeah, I think, you know, we definitely in the last year or two, this idea has been like a lot more centered in skate academia, which is really cool. But I also feel like it definitely lacks unpacking and maybe even like critical discussions about what a rolling ethnography allows you to see, or maybe what it allows you to not see. I personally, yeah, really value skate research from people who don't do a rolling ethnography, which, like, really simply put, it's people who don't consider themselves skaters. So you could look at Carrie's like research with sort of gendered skateboarding in the UK. Arguably, like, I don't know, I feel like Becky Bill's probably too much of a bit of a legend nowadays to not consider her a skateboarder. But maybe like earlier on in her like research wouldn't necessarily identify as a skateboarder. And I just think, yeah, that's really like valuable knowledge to look at something like skateboarding from the outside. So yeah, I just like wanted to unpack what a rolling ethnography meant for me, how like that's kind of unfolded, and then kind of use these ideas to sort of like I can take some questions after, and then I'd love to hear some of what came through your own rolling ethnographies, because I assume that this is a call full of people doing skateboarding research. So like my contribution to a rolling ethnography is what I called like building skate parks to make sense of skate parks. This was yeah, really inspired obviously by my work with Concrete Jungle Foundation, which is essentially like my entry into the field at the Freedom Skatepark and just skateboarding academic research in general. And this idea was my involvement in the research and the projects have always been from helping physically build the skate parks, and from kind of a design lens that sort of gives you this really like embedded knowledge about the project. And that for me comes from way before having to way before having to physically build the skate park, but also, you know, work with all the stakeholders and fundraising and designing the skate park and all of that stuff. So that's kind of was my contribution to a rolling ethnography, and I've written about that, about the Freedom Skate Park, about the Grove DIY, and also in the chapter about Seven Hills Skate Park that got published recently with Cuba. And they're all free skate parks where I've physically been involved with like the building of them. And from doing that, you know, I'm materially engaging with sort of the making, the happening of this skate park, which produces this like really embedded in-depth knowledge about how the project happened, the kind of power dynamics on the building site and all of that stuff. So yeah, here's like some other ways in which I've been exploring that idea through, you know, having this like quite like situated access to these kind of processes. Yeah, I'll just go this one. So for me, like a rolling ethnography means like three things. For me, it means that you create a method assemblage, meaning you're not just limited to doing interviews or just surveys like it was for the project I was talking about before, but it creates like it opens up what you can consider research. The second one, and this is like quite important for my own sort of design research, is that it's about co-creating knowledge. And like, yeah, that's really important when we're talking about sort of like decolonial projects and that kind of stuff. And the last one is like about the ethical issues. I think you sort of you come head to head with sort of different kinds of ethical issues when you're doing this sort of situated research methods. And the quote at the top is sort of again from this book here. Bill talks about like cultural probes as a way to generate knowledge. For me, in my methods chapter of my thesis, I sort of talk about the Freedom Skate Park as like one big cultural probe. Like it's a big research device in which people come and engage and produce knowledge through the Freedom Skate Park. And that sort of like runs through like all of these three kind of key ideas for me about what a rolling ethnography means. And yeah, I guess one thing I'm doing more as well is sort of like expanding what I mean by like building skate parks to make sense of skate parks. because more recently, I'm like, one thing I'm really excited about doing is just like continuously researching and publishing about like the Freedom Skatepark from its like inception in 2018, which I did in the chapter from Jim and Jack's book, to kind of like revisiting it a few years later, which I'm doing for Indie's collected edition coming out next year, and to continue that process, which is obviously then sort of extends the research method to be not just about the physical construction, but the making of the skate park itself. Um, so just going back to that research project I did in 2021, like I said, those graphs, when I had the two kind of groups of kids side by side, and the local kids showed like this super clear improvement compared to the kids who were only going to the skate park once a month. For me, it was so obvious why that was, because aside from doing that research project, I was managing the skate park for the summer with the alongside the Jamaican skateboarders when CGF was still like really active and delivering programming there. Um, so just this image on the right, like just when I was just sitting in that hut and looking out through it, I could just, really obviously witness first hand through being involved with the day-to-day running of the park, why those graphs were had that kind of difference between the two groups. And I think that was like down to this like making of the skate park. Like in that 3 months, I wasn't just there as a researcher. I was teaching skateboarding to those kids. I was, driving them home to their parents. I was, driving them to the hospital when they got injured. Like, you're part of the day-to-day life. So this rolling ethnography becomes like way greater than just like the standard methods. And this is what I think it's John Law. I think his name's John Law. This is what John Law calls a method assemblage. Standard methods are badly adapted to the study of the ephemeral, the indefinite, and the irregular. Probably three words that couldn't capture skateboarding better. The need then is heterogeneity and variation, a way of point to articulate a sense of the world as an uninformed but generative flux of forces and relations that produce particular realities. So I think that's perfect to think about the limits of that research project I did before. I'm thinking it was only really through surveys and some interviews, and I captured that very singular idea of what skateboarding was. So what John's saying here is like the more methods you use, the more realities that we can understand. So here's just like a few examples of like different kind of methods I've used from the building skate parks to make sense of them. To like the image in the middle is really interesting because this is where I've done a lot of my interviews around the Freedom Skatepark, which is at Jamnesia Surf Camp, which is like this really super important community institution where the skate park exists. And a lot of times I'll do an interview sitting in the front yard of the surf camp, and by the end of the interview, it's turned into a focus group basically with everyone like coming in and passing by, and that's like I'm always like stoked when that happens, and that like really brings this like quite natural, organic like interview setting where people can like pass in and dip in and out when they want, rather than having this like like sometimes it really feels like you're like forcing people into doing interviews, and then that can like create quite like rigid expectations of like what is an interview. Whereas you're just like hanging out in this front yard, asking questions, having these like productive conversations. It really like goes into this like really interesting place, I find. And so that's like a really interesting way. Um, and then yeah, obviously like in skateboarding as well, we have all these sort of alternative means to or like alternative medias to that document our practice, as well as like then they become sort of units of study too. And obviously that's kind of what Duncan was getting at with the rolling ethnography and the archive of the city below the knee, being like, skate films are really valuable um, pieces of research for us, um, which is true. But obviously that extends to not just being about film. So for instance, I've used some zines here. But I also think that's quite like a um, narrow idea of like understanding like what skate media is as well. Especially like in terms of skateboarding in Jamaica. There's like only ever been a handful of actual like what we're more familiar with as like skate edits or skate films. That doesn't so much happen in Jamaica in the scene there. So it's like what other like ways are these projects being like visually documented? Um, so obviously being like an NGO and a skate NGO, we get a lot of like volunteers come through who want to film documentaries about our work, and they become really interesting kind of units of study to be like, how are these like highly curated documentaries like again articulating the work that we do. And also, like I said, the scene in Jamaica don't so much make uh skate edits, but are like really active on social media. And for me as a researcher who's not based in Jamaica, that's a really useful way for me to keep up to date with the kind of things that are going on at the skate park. But then also thinking about, and this is something I'm like thinking about in a paper at the moment, about applying the same concept as if a skate edit is, archiving the city from below the knee, then what is like creating sort of edits on like things like TikTok and Instagram, which the Jamaican skate scene do far, far more regularly than creating an edit. Like what kind of knowledge does that produce? For instance, the camera is not below the knee all of a sudden. And kind of thinking about that kind of social media influencer kind of um, aesthetic and what that tells you about like what the Freedom Skatepark is and isn't has been like a really interesting thing to explore for my thesis as well. And what does it mean to do like philanthropy work, and what does that look like in skateboarding in the modern day? Um, but also there are more standard sort of, yeah, skaters go to Jamaica a lot and produce like edits, and they're also really interesting kind of cultural artifacts to dive deep into and think about in terms of like what Duncan was saying in his shred talk around like Orientalism and stuff like that. Like, how does the kind of mainstream skateboarding media view Jamaica and the scene there, and what kind of um tropes are sort of produced through these videos, or what kind of identity does Thrasher give to the Jamaican skateboarding scene? That's like super interesting too. Um, so here I'm getting at like a rolling ethnography and co-creating knowledge. Um, Sanders and Brian's book is like littered with this like amazing analysis on kind of the different ways in which we can study skateboarding through like senses, like a phenomenological lens. And I really like the article they wrote about writing that book like a skate session. Um, so then thinking about what does it mean to do like research like a skate session. Um, and there's just like this really nice quote here from Tim, who was the programs manager for CGF at the Freedom Skatepark for 2 years after it was built. Um, I'll just read this out. It was really great for the organization and for the planning of what was happening with the Freedom Skatepark, there was this sort of breathing space, that there was sort of these 2 months that we could really get to know each other better and with each other. Well, that's a typo. Because I feel like after the construction, there was still a little bit of distance between us in the sense of the local skaters and CJF. But over those 2 months, we got to spend a lot more time together, be at the skate park together, get more of a feeling of who we are. And that's also led to a lot more organic conversations about what kind of plans there were for the Freedom Skatepark, how to run certain things than it was before. Like I remember during the construction, I tried to have a few conversations with them, but it was maybe approached a bit too formal. It had a lot more of a natural flow into opening it and starting those things that I think it would have if we would have started opening up straight after construction. So although it's not about doing research per se, Tim is just saying like how because of COVID, we basically or he got to like hang out with the skaters in a lot more like informal, just skating kind of way. And then because of that, everyone got to know each other in this, skateboarding way essentially. and then yeah. So and then that like fed into this more organic approach to like developing the space, which is definitely the kind of thing we're aiming for with our work at Concrete Jungle Foundation. And I just think from my experience, like skateboarding, like I said about the research project before, like being in the day-to-day life of those kids made me understand the role skateboarding was having in their life in this way more like multi-sensorial way than just like viewing that data from like purely like a kind of objectified like quantified way through the surveys. So yeah, so that's like kind of one way that I think skateboarding is like co-creating knowledge. It's like kind of this participatory research practice. And another as well, again, doing research in this like philanthropic NGO context. You're always sort of being careful about your sort of like power dynamics of entering spaces like Bull Bay in Jamaica and, not just like extracting knowledge. And yeah, I feel like this kind of idea about researching as like a skate session can flatten that hierarchy for sure. Like a different hierarchy emerges when you're skating, right? It's like based on other things. And as I'm going to talk in a bit, that sometimes can be just as bad as like the researching hierarchy because it can be based on, risk and ability and that kind of thing. But it definitely shifts that away. Like my role as a researcher is like changed when I'm doing because of my like skateboarding sort of like practice that I bring to researching as well. So that brings into like the last issue, which is about doing a rolling ethnography and kind of like I was saying, a rolling ethnography is essentially doing participatory action research, which is, situated research within the community. Like you're adding to the community as well as doing research. And yeah, I already spoke about how different hierarchies exist within like skateboarding or skate sessions. And then that can also affect your research and like the kind of lens that you view it through. This is definitely something that I've experienced across all the kind of field sites that I've done research. And both at the Grove and also at the Freedom Skatepark, both of those spaces I like would consider myself a researcher like second after being someone who's maybe works there or maybe purely visits there for leisure, or maybe not purely, but they're both kind of like leisure or workspaces first, then the researcher. And then within that, you just like, I've been involved with the Freedom Skatepark since 2018, and the board and the kids and their parents and the managers and the skaters, and you have some good times and you have some bad times, and you're like part of their life, and if you like it or not, your research then also like becomes part of that life. And the Freedom Skatepark is in Kingston, and there's all kinds of sort of things going on like around like society and like gang violence, and like the Freedom Skatepark doesn't like exist in a vacuum. It's like part of that, and the kind of research you're doing and the kind of stories that you're sort of inquiring about create ethical like considerations in terms of like safety for yourself, for the people you're talking to, and also like how the publication of certain knowledge might endanger or annoy the wrong person and that kind of thing, as well as like the personal beefs that go on around these projects. We're all just like human beings, and when you're doing research on a project that's 6, 7, 8 years old and everyone's been working with each other, you obviously have had certain disagreements and stuff. So yeah, you're sort of like dealing with all these issues, and I think that a rolling ethnography sort of puts you in a position that you're more prone to these kind of ethical dilemmas that extend beyond like a very like one-dimensional kind of like research ethics kind of thing. It becomes like personal, and it becomes community-wide ethics. So that's kind of like the summary, really. Rolling ethnographies are about going with the flow. Flow was something that just kept coming up throughout all these ideas. I'm not sure if you noticed through the you're rolling, you're in moving, you're going in a direction, you're not really like 100% in control, depending on how good you are at researching or skateboarding. So it's about like developing like emerging methods that sort of come through the direction that you end up going through these kind of ethnographies. For me, like I'm always trying to research sideways, like I'm always trying to include as much as possible the people who are part of this project. I'm thinking about my research as like something that we co-create together. And the last one is like, yeah, what I said about the ethics. I think a rolling ethnography puts you in a particularly in-depth and interesting sort of like ethical dilemma. And I'm really interested in my thesis about this idea of like inventive research ethics, which a colleague of mine, Sarah Pennington, like develops in her thesis about how in design research we have this idea of like speculative design, where you kind of create problems, and when you create problems you sort of like learn about how people respond to those problems, and kind of ideas about like different kind of futures that we want to go, what directions we want to go, and that kind of thing. And Sarah sort of says you can't predict the kind of ethical dilemmas that are going to come up through speculative design and this kind of inventive problem making. So you also then need to have kind of an inventive ethical practice, which which is kind of something I'm trying to practice as well. But yeah, it comes with like very difficult situations and things like that. And one thing I've been trying to do more often is things like safeguarding training and first aid training. Obviously, working at a skate park with young children, and if people haven't done it yet, the like Ben Raymer's suicide first aid training is like amazing. And again, if you're doing community research, I think that should, in skateboarding, I think that's something that you should all definitely do. And that's what I mean by like inventive ethics. Like you're kind of thinking ahead about what kind of ethical issues might arise when you're doing research in these kind of spaces. So that
Sorry.
was
Oh, thank you.
it.
Just doing my timekeeping with Ben here. I'll let you just finish your final comments.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Sorry, I kind of lost track of time because I didn't have my timekeeper up with my notes.
It's been
Oh,
a
yeah.
it's been a fascinating talk. We're just on the hour, and so I'm just mindful that some people are working and may want to ask some questions before they have to get back to their days.
Yeah.
Ben, are you there? I'm going to throw it to you if you've got internet stability, maybe to kick off.
Yeah, can you hear me or am I cutting out a lot?
It sounds pretty clear. I'm going to stop
Okay, cool.
recording as well. So thank you, Tom, and we're going to go to question time. So I'm going to hand over to
Awesome. I'll probably stop